is a great privilege we have this morning to hear from Geoff Surratt. Geoff is an old friend of this church. He is well respected around the country and around the world. And he has worked with a lot of pastors and a lot of churches over the last 40 years and has done an amazing job of it. He's going to teach us this morning. Would you please make Geoff feel welcome this morning?
Thank you. It is so much fun to be here. I was with you on a Sunday back in the summer. It's great to be back. Love Mission Hills. Love Pastor Craig. We're good friends. We get together all the time regularly to pray together and talk about church and talk about kids and sometimes cry together and laugh together and love kind of vicariously walking the journey with you through Pastor Craig. And of course, before that, Pastor Mike was a good friend and just love being here with you guys this Sunday. Love the as Danny mentioned, my wife and I, we live over in Parker. We've been back in Colorado for about 8 years. I grew up here till I was about 12 years old and moved away, and then couldn't stay away from the Broncos any longer, so I came back a few years ago. And love being here today. Love the series that we are in. If you weren't here last week, Pastor Craig kicked off the series, Living Proof, and we're looking at the book of John, and we're just picking out some things throughout the book of John. In fact, 7 different signs, 7 different miracles in the book. Now, I love the book of John. It's the 4th gospel listed in our New Testament. It's actually, as many of you know, the last gospel that was written, the last story about Jesus' life. In fact, by the time John writes this, he's a very old man, maybe as old as 90 years old, and he has the perspective of time. Matthew, Mark, and Luke have already written their books. They are in circulation. Those in the church, Christians, have read those gospels. And so John isn't trying to give a complete biography of Jesus, but he's trying to convey who Jesus is and what that means to us. And so he selects 7 miracles that Jesus did throughout his life, and he writes about those. Last weekend, Pastor Craig kicked it off with the miracle that is in John chapter 2, where Jesus goes to a wedding, and then at the wedding he turns water into wine. How many of you tried that at home this week? It's really not a home winery instructable. It's more about, as Pastor Craig said, how we invite Jesus into our everyday life. Something everyday like a wedding or what's going on. How do we bring Jesus into that? This week we're going to look at a second sign. It's going to be in John chapter 4. If you have a Bible, you can open up to that. Don't worry if you don't. We're going to have some verses on the screen. And we're going to look at a miraculous healing that Jesus did for an official's son that comes from Capernaum. But we'll get into that in a minute because I want to talk a little bit about miracles. We're going to talk about how miracles happen today. But as we do, I want to look at 3 questions about miracles. I want to look at what is a miracle? Do miracles still happen? And if they do, how do they work? So let's talk about what is a miracle. Let me give you some examples, and you guys kind of vote and decide whether or not you think these would qualify as miracles. Okay, first one. If the Rockies win the World Series this year, is that a miracle? Right, yeah, because you know the bullpen, right? That would take a miracle. How about this one? If you win the lottery, would that be a miracle? It'd be more of a miracle if I win the lottery because I don't play the lottery. So that would be pretty amazing. Now, let me give you one from my childhood. So I grew up, as I said, here in Colorado, and I was a typical 10-year-old boy. In other words, all fun, all ideas, no logic whatsoever, okay? And one day I remember we were riding as a family, riding in the car, and there was my mom and dad, and my older sister, my older brother, and myself. And somehow I'd gotten a seat by the door. And some of you might say, were you wearing a seatbelt? That's hilarious. That is so funny. This was back in the 60s. We didn't even know there were seatbelts. My dad used to tuck them in the seats so they wouldn't bother us while we rode. And since they were lap belts, we were probably better off without them. But anyway, I was riding in the seat, 10 years old, bored. We're driving down I-70, and somehow pops into my head, I think I can run as fast as this car. Now, logic isn't playing. Fun is, though. That'd be fun if I could run as fast as this car. Now, I never had an idea that I didn't want to try out as soon as I could. So I decided I'd try it right then. So I opened the back door. Child locks, again. So I opened the back door of the car while we're driving 70 miles an hour down the freeway, and I put my foot out to start running beside the car. Now, I don't know how many of you have tried this, but it's not a good idea. When your foot hits the pavement at 70 miles an hour, you lose control of your foot. And so my foot starts doing this next to the car. And immediately, even as a little guy, I'm thinking, bad idea, bad idea, bad idea. But I'm kind of stuck. I don't know what to do. Now, my father, being an incredible driver in the 60s, he was able to reach into the back seat, grab me, pull me back into the car, shut the door of the car, beat me. I'm not saying you should beat your children. Some of them maybe need it, but no. Beats me, never takes his eyes off the road, never slows down. Is that a miracle? I don't know. We'll get back to that. So I looked up a definition of miracles. A definition for miracles from the Oxford Dictionary is this. It's an extraordinary and welcome event that is not explicable by natural or scientific laws and is therefore attributed to a divine agency. I have kind of a simpler definition of a miracle. Here's a definition I use. A miracle is something that's so extraordinary that it can only be explained by God. Let me give that to you again. Something so extraordinary, extraordinary, out of the ordinary, that it can only be explained by God. So that's a definition, working definition of miracles. So do miracles still happen? There's different theological camps. Some say that, at the end of the New Testament, that was the end of miracles. No, I'm not here to argue that. I just want to give you my opinion and my experience, and you can kind of work from that. My opinion is miracles still happen. Let me give you a couple things that kind of convince me that miracles still happen. One is just the experience of being in nature. Years ago, my wife and I lived in Charleston, South Carolina. We lived right on the East Coast. And there's a waterway that runs up and down the East Coast called the Intercoastal. And off of the Intercoastal are little tidal creeks. And we had a little fishing boat. I remember one day being out on one of those little tidal creeks just off of the Intercoastal. And the sun was beginning to go down. It was a beautiful day, cloudless skies. The rays of the sun are sparkling across the water. And as I sit there, I can see the water is smooth, there's no wind, and I see bait fish just breaking the surface of the water. In that area of the country, there are oysters. They grow in large hills. They're called oyster rakes. And if you're out there in the evening, you can hear them. They actually make a snapping noise. And so the oysters are snapping. The bait fish are hitting the water. The egrets flying overhead are swooping down and catching fish. And just a few yards from my boat, out on the Intercoastal, I see a school of dolphins swim past on the water. And I remember sitting there in awe of the miracle of God. Even this morning as I drove over at 7 o'clock from Parker, heading west toward the mountains, and the sun was just coming up, and I saw the mountains turning from pink to purple, and I just thought, this is extraordinary. It's a miracle. So from nature, I think that miracles happen. From the changed lives that I see, I think are miraculous. Seeing people go from a life being lost to being found. I remember I pastored for several years in Houston, or outside of Houston, in rural Texas, a little town called Huffman. It was a tiny little town, 2 gas stations and a post office was all that was really there in our little church. And one day a lady walks in, a young lady walks in, and she's obviously not from that area of the country. She's not dressed like us. She doesn't talk like us. And afterwards we get to know her and meet her. Her name is Kathy, and Kathy has just relocated with 2 of her daughters from Los Angeles. And as we get to know Kathy's story, her life had been messed up. It had been drugs, and it had been alcohol, it had been parties. Her kids were starting to go off the rails, and she had finally told her husband, I'm done. I'm not doing it anymore. You can stay. I'm leaving. And she came to Huffman, Texas, because she said it in every way, it was the furthest from Los Angeles that she could go. And we saw Kathy continue to come to our church and to learn about Christ, and we saw a beginning of life change. And eventually her husband Bernie followed her out there, and Bernie was an alcoholic. He had been addicted to drugs and alcohol for many, many years, and we saw Jesus begin to work in Bernie's life as well. In fact, on a Christmas Sunday, a year after Bernie and Kathy moved out, I had Bernie come up in front of our little congregation, and I said, Bernie, tell us what you were doing a year ago on Christmas Day. He said, a year ago, my wife had moved out here. She had left me. I was standing on a corner in Burbank, California, and I was trying to buy cocaine. And I said, Bernie, what's happened since then? And Bernie said, I came to know Jesus. I haven't had a drink of alcohol. I haven't had any drugs since that day. We saw Bernie and Kathy continue to grow in their faith. We saw their daughters come to know Jesus. When their daughters grew up, one of them married a pastor, and one of them married a missionary. We saw complete transformation of Bernie and Kathy from people who were so lost in partying and alcohol and drugs and hopeless and helpless in this world to people who loved their kids and gave everything they had so people could know about Jesus. To me, that's a miracle of life transformation. I've seen miracles of healing. I've seen financial miracles, relational miracles. In fact, let me ask today in this crowd, how many of you would say sometime in your life you think you've witnessed what you would call a miracle? Okay. A lot of us believe in miracles. The truth is this is personal for some of us because today, if we were honest, we would say, I need a miracle in my life. There is a diagnosis. There is a relationship. There is a financial thing. There is depression. There is anxiety. There is something in my life or in a loved one's life that is so overwhelming and out of control, and I don't know where to turn, and I desperately need a miracle from God. And if that's you, that's what we want to talk about for the rest of our time today is a definition of miracle, something so extraordinary that can only be explained by God. A belief that, yes, miracles still happen, so the question then remains, how does God do miracles? And so at this miracle in John chapter 4, we get some insight into how miracles work. We pick up the story that Pastor Craig left last week. We were in John 2, and Jesus turns the water into wine. He's in Cana. After that, Jesus goes down to Jerusalem in Judea. In fact, let me talk about geography just for a second, because this can get confusing, Judea and Cana and Capernaum and all that kind of stuff. And for those of you who know New Testament geography well, don't listen to this next part because it kind of works, okay? But for simple people like me, it works, all right? So Judea, Galilee, all of that. Let's think of Judea as Colorado, okay? It's kind of like a state, okay? We're going to think of Jerusalem as Denver. It's the capital of Colorado. It's also a very influential city all through this part of the country. So Judea and Jerusalem, that's going to be like Colorado and Denver. Now, Jesus is headed back to Galilee, and Cana and Capernaum are going to come into play. So let's think about those. Let's think of Galilee as Wyoming, okay? It's kind of like it's another state. Not as many people live up there. The people in Judea know it's up there, but they don't ever go there unless they have to, that kind of thing. Sorry, Wyoming. Capernaum is kind of like Cheyenne, major city in Galilee. Everyone in Galilee knows where it is. Pretty much everybody in Judea would know where Capernaum is, okay? So that kind of represents Capernaum and Cheyenne. And Cana is kind of like Laramie. We all know Laramie exists, but none of us know where it is, right? Some of you are saying, I know where it is. It's because you're from Wyoming, okay? As Pastor Craig told us last week, we don't know exactly where Cana was. We have an idea. We know that it was probably about an hour's trip by foot from Capernaum to Cana. So that kind of gives you the geography of this. So Jesus has gone to Judea, to Jerusalem. And while he was in Jerusalem, he cleared the temple. You may know that story where he drove people out who were ripping people off in the temple. And then we know from other gospels, he performed other miracles. He begins to get a little bit of fame and stuff starts happening. And he heads back up to Wyoming. He heads back up to Galilee. On the way, he stops in Samaria and he meets a woman by the well. He kind of talks to her about her life. She decides to become a Christ follower. She gets her friends to come and listen to Jesus. They decide to become Christ followers. And he stays there for a couple of days. That's where we pick up the story. So we're going to pick it up in John chapter 4 with the 43rd verse. After 2 days in Samaria, he departed for Galilee, for Jesus himself had testified that a prophet has no honor in his own hometown. So when he came to Galilee, the Galileans welcomed him, having seen all that he had done in Jerusalem at the feast, the cleansing of the temple, some of the other miracles, for they too had gone to the feast. So he came to Cana in Galilee, where he made the water wine. And at Capernaum, there was an official whose son was ill. Let's stop there for just a second. Remember, Jesus is in Cana, which is kind of like Laramie, and this guy is over in Capernaum, which is kind of like Cheyenne. It's about a day's walk away, and we know that he was an official. And based on the language that John uses here, we believe that he was an official in Herod Antipas' court, okay? Herod Antipas, he was the governor basically over this area. He was served under the authority of Rome. It gets really confusing as you read through the New Testament because there's a lot of guys named Herod. There's Herod's Antipas's dad, who's Herod the Great, and then Herod has a brother named, guess what? Herod. And then when Herod gets married, guess who he marries? Herodias. It just gets ridiculous, okay? Just know this particular Herod is the one that when Jesus is tried at the end of his life by Pilate, and then he gets sent over to Herod, this is the Herod he gets sent to, Herod Antipas. This official is in his court. And we know that's a big deal. I mean, that's a high-level position. There's a lot of clout that comes down from Rome through Herod to this official. We also know that he was very likely well off, very rich, because there would not be a poor person in this court. We know that he was Jewish because anyone in Herod's court would have been Jewish. This is not a Roman palace. This is a Jewish palace. And we also know that he was likely very secular. A very religious Jew would never serve in the court of Herod. Does that make sense? So this guy that's coming to Jesus, he's wealthy, he has influence, he's Jewish, but he's kind of a secular Jew. And so we kind of pick up the story. When this man heard that Jesus had come from Judea to Galilee, he went to Jesus. That's a one-day journey. He walks to Jesus, and he asks him to come down and heal his son, for he was at the point of death. It's a remarkable situation. This guy with a lot of power, a lot of money, a lot of clout. He hears about this wandering rabbi, uneducated. Nobody knows quite what's going on. They heard some stuff happen in Jerusalem, but don't know what that's all about. Maybe heard a little bit about this wedding thing that sounded kind of weird. And this guy decides to take a day's journey to go get this wandering, uneducated rabbi to come back with him to his house. That's very remarkable. Why would he do that? It's because he's desperate. His son is dying. All of us who have kids, grandkids, we know what that's like. When our kids are sick, when they are in trouble, when there is something going on, there's nothing we won't do to help. He is facing an impossible situation. And that's our first principle of miracles. Miracles always begin with the impossible. They always begin with the impossible. If you have a situation in your life that the reality is you can probably figure it out. Maybe you need to work harder. Maybe you need to work less. Maybe you need to rest more. Maybe you need to eat better. Maybe you need to exercise. Maybe you need to be just nicer to the people around you. There are things that you could do that you're having a tough time that maybe you could work through that. You don't need a miracle. Now, those are tough situations, but those are not situations that demand a miracle. Miracles are when it's impossible. I have done everything I can. There's nothing else I can do. I have no place else to turn. And that is when God steps in. So miracles begin with the impossible. And so let's see what happens. Jesus said to him, to this father, the father comes and he says, Jesus, you got to come heal my son. So Jesus responds and he says, unless you see signs and wonders, you will not believe. Jesus isn't being rude. He's just stating the facts. Basically, this guy comes not because he believes in Jesus, not because he has faith, not because he wants to submit his life to God. That's not what it's about at all. He comes because he believes this guy might be able to do a miracle. He believes in the miracle, not the miracle worker. And Jesus is saying, unless you see a miracle, you're never going to believe in me. It's just a fact. It's just where it's at. Now, for some people, that would be very offensive. For a high official who feels like he's lowered himself to come to this uneducated rabbi, and the rabbi is going to lecture him about faith? No, I don't think so. I don't think that's going to happen. But that's not what happens. Jesus says this to the man, and he is undeterred. He keeps coming. He keeps asking. The verse says that the official said to him, "Sir, come down before my child dies." You see, the second principle of miracles is miracles often require persistence. Miracles require us asking and hanging in there and not giving up, because God is not like a vending machine, is he? It's not like we stick the right prayer in, hit the right button, and the right miracle comes out. That's not how God works at all. God wants to know, do we have faith in him? Do we love him? Are we willing to stay at it and believe that he is going to act? And here's what I have discovered in my own life. It's in the times that I am waiting for God to move. It's in the times when I am desperate. It is in the times when I don't give up and I continue to ask. It's in those times that I come closest to God. It's in those times that I learn the most about Jesus. It's in those times that when I am worshiping, God feels my heart. The Holy Spirit comes beside me and comforts me when I'm waiting, when I am persistent and I don't give up. Jesus encourages us in Matthew chapter 7. He says, keep on asking and you will receive what you ask for. Keep on seeking and you will find. Keep on knocking and the door will be open to you. So this guy comes to Jesus and said, Jesus, you got to come. You got to come this day's journey. Come with me to my house, heal my son. Jesus says, you don't have real faith here, man. You got to see a miracle before you believe. And the guy says, be that as it may. Jesus, you got to come. You got to come. Heal my son. Look what Jesus does in the next verse, verse 50. Jesus said to him, go, your son will live. Here's the interesting thing. That's not what he asked for. Remember what he asked for? He said, Jesus, come with me. We're going to walk for a day. We're going to go to my house. What he's asking for is that's how miracles work. He knows. He's heard about the other miracles Jesus performed. He's read some in the Old Testament about those miracles. He knows how miracles work. Here's how miracles work. Jesus comes. He comes to your house. He goes to whoever's sick. Maybe he has a little flask of oil in his back pocket, and he makes the sign of the cross on his forehead. Well, he probably doesn't do that. But he lays hands on him, prays, and he gets healed. That's how miracles work. And Jesus doesn't do the miracle that way. Jesus says, I'm not even coming to your house. I'm not making the one-day journey. You're going to have to trust me. You're going to have to believe. You're going to have to just head back home. Your son's going to live, but you're going to have to believe and have faith in that. Jesus says, go, and your son will live. And that's the third principle, is that miracles seldom look like we think they should. Miracles seldom look like we think they should. I experienced this in our life a few years ago. Our daughter, we have a son and a daughter. Daughter's younger. Our daughter, when she was about 12 or 13 years old, she began experiencing panic attacks, big anxiety. And if you've ever experienced panic attacks or worked with a child who has, it's terrifying. And she would think that she was dying, her heart was racing. I lost count of the number of times in the middle of the night when we ran to the ER to get an EKG for the doctor to just come out and say she's fine, her heart is fine. These panic attacks became debilitating for her to the point that she wouldn't go to slumber parties with her friends. She hated going on travel trips with her sports teams because she never knew when a panic attack would hit. Sometimes we would get calls in the middle of the day from school saying, you got to come get me, you got to come get me. We would be woken up in the middle of the night, her at our door with tears and sweating and scared to death and saying, I'm dying, I'm dying, I'm dying, and a 15-year-old girl. And we prayed desperately for God to heal her. I believe in miracles. I've seen miracles. God, you've got to do this miracle. And I knew what the miracle looked like. Here's what it looked like. It looked like the panic attacks going away completely, the anxiety and the fear going away completely. And my daughter could stand on a stage like this and she could say, once I had panic attacks, but I no longer do. God has completely healed me. That's how miracles are supposed to work. But that's not how God did this miracle. God instead helped my daughter learn to live with panic attacks. He helped her to learn to recognize them and to know when they were coming on and to be able to name them in the middle and to be able to say to us, I'm having a panic attack. He helped her learn through all kinds of sources to how to breathe and how to think. He helped her to tell other people dealing with panic attacks, hey, I've been there. I know what it's like. Let me help you walk through this. And now as a young adult, occasionally she still has a panic attack, but she can deal with it. It's not debilitating. She doesn't run to the ER anymore. That's the miracle that God has worked in her life. And it's not the miracle her dad drew out, but through this, she has grown in her faith. She has grown in so many other ways through what God is doing in her life. And that's the thing about miracles. We know exactly what the miracle should look like. They should come home. They should not leave. The diagnosis should change. That's what it should look like. But what we need to know is that God is not ignoring you. He's writing a different story. He's writing a bigger story. He's inviting you into his story. And so it may feel like this isn't the miracle I prayed for. We have faith that God, this is the miracle that you are doing. Let's look at the next principle, the next verse. Jesus says, "Go and your son will live." And this line is significant. The man believed. What did he believe? He didn't believe the miracle, he believed the word. He believed the word that Jesus spoke to him, and he went on his way. You see, there's been a shift in his faith. The shift has been from faith in a miracle to faith in a miracle worker. And that's the principle, is that miracles always demand faith. They always demand that we believe in God. This man's faith wasn't perfect, Jesus said that, but it was growing and shifting. Faith is believing God's promises, even when we don't see his hand at work. I love what Hebrews says in the 10th chapter. The writer of Hebrews says, "Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful." You may not see God at work right now. You may not see him working, but hang on to the faith that you know that he's at work. When this guy leaves the house where Jesus was staying in Cana, and he starts down the road, he has not seen a miracle. He does not know what has happened, but he is taking step by step by step in faith. We pick up the story in verse 51. "And as the father was going down, his servants met him and told him that his son was recovering. So he asked them the hour when he began to get better. And they said to him, 'Yesterday at the 7th hour, the fever left him.' And the father knew that that was the hour when Jesus had said to him, 'Your son will live.' And he himself believed in all his household. This was now the second sign that Jesus did when he had come from Judea to Galilee." Notice how this man's faith progressed. He moved from desperation to belief. He moved from faith in miracles to faith in the miracle worker. He now is a Christ follower, not just a miracle follower, a Christ follower. He now is bringing glory to God and pointing to Jesus. He is now pointing his entire family to Jesus. And that's the last principle I want to talk about, is miracles always bring glory to God. Miracles always point people to Jesus. Miracles are never about what I need and what I want, though that is often what I receive. They're always about bringing glory and pointing people to God. So let's go back to the miracles we talked about at the beginning. If the Rockies win the World Series, is that really a miracle? No. It's not pointing people to God. If you win the lottery, is that really a miracle? The chances are tiny, but it doesn't make it a miracle. It's not pointing people to God. A crazy 10-year-old boy deciding he can run as fast as a car, surviving, is that a miracle? It's good that it did. I'm here. It's not really a miracle. It didn't point people to God. Whatever is happening in your life, whatever you're praying for now, ultimately God is working his purpose to point people to Jesus. I'll tell you one more reason I believe in miracles, and then I want to pray for the miracle that you're praying for, because my faith has changed over the last 6 months. When I was with you in June, I probably mentioned that my daughter was pregnant with our 4th grandchild, our 2nd grandson. He was due in the middle of November, and some complications happened, my daughter's blood pressure, things like that. And so they decided to induce 3 weeks early. It was down in Castle Rock at the hospital down there, and they induced her. And through the day, while we were waiting to see what was happening, there were some complications. The baby's heartbeat wasn't what they wanted it to be. And so we just thought that there would be a C-section sometime Friday night, and then on Saturday morning, we'd meet our new grandson. And so we kissed our daughter goodnight when we left the hospital and went to bed, looking forward to the next day of meeting little Copeland David, our newest grandson. But we woke instead at 4:15 in the morning to a text from my son-in-law that said, "I can't talk, just pray." And we jumped in the car and we drove from Parker to Castle Rock as fast as we could. When we got to our daughter's room, which was going to be the delivery room, it was empty except for my son-in-law's parents, and they said that they had just come and got Freddie to go see the baby for the very first time. As the day unfolded, we found out that the baby was not taken by C-section until it was way late in the process, and then it was an emergency, and the umbilical cord was wrapped around his little neck 3 times. He didn't breathe. In fact, he had no heartbeat for 7 minutes. Couldn't breathe on his own. They rushed him from Castle Rock to Rocky Mountain Children's Hospital. I drove down there as soon as I could. I saw the little guy. I think we may have a picture of him laying in that hospital, unconscious. We sat down with the doctor at Rocky Mountain, and she said, it's pretty grim. She said when they brought him in, he had no response at all. We touched his cornea, and he didn't blink. We gave him an IV. He didn't flinch. He can't breathe on his own. I don't know if you know the APGAR score, but his APGAR was 0. She said, my job is to tell you the truth. And I said, Doc, are we going to lose him? And she said, we don't anticipate in the next 4 to 6 hours anything happening, but you need to get your daughter to this hospital. And I said, Doc, the doc at the other hospital said she needs to stay there. And she looked me in the eye and she said, you need to get your daughter here today. We didn't know if the little guy was going to live through the night. If he lived through the night, we didn't know what hope he had, what future he had. They have a procedure with children, babies that are oxygen deprived at birth, where they cool their body temperature down to about 90 degrees, and they keep them there for 3 days in kind of a chemically induced coma. And so for 3 days, we walked into that hospital where the little guy was just unconscious, and tubes and wires coming out of every directions and monitors, and we saw no change. And they said after 3 days, we're going to warm him up, and when he warms up, he should begin to breathe on his own, and we'll take him off the ventilator. So we prayed Saturday and Sunday and Monday, and Tuesday came and they began to warm him up, and no change. He still couldn't breathe. He was still just laid there motionless. And in the midst of the darkness, we reached out to small groups, we reached out to friends. We had people from all over the country and some around the world begin to pray and to text and to call. Our worship team at the church that we're a part of, the whole production team, came up to the NICU at Children's Hospital, and for 2 hours they stood in the NICU and just prayed for my grandson. I came out and talked to him and told him that I am in a place right now that I can't even pray, but you're literally praying our prayers for us. I don't think I've ever been in a more desperate place, desperate for a miracle for this innocent little baby. At the darkest time, in the darkest night, a friend texted a link to a song on YouTube. We had heard the song once or twice. It was a good song. But in that moment, it grabbed our hearts. And we began to just claim the lyrics of this song. They're biblically based, but we began to claim the lyrics of this song as our prayer. And the song said, God, you are a way maker. You are a miracle worker. You are a promise keeper. You are a light in the darkness. And we just listened to that song over and over and over again, and we just reminded God again and again, God, you're a miracle worker. You're a miracle worker. You're a miracle worker. And the miracle I was praying for is the little guy who would open his eyes, grab a bottle, down it, and head to his house. That's not the miracle we got. Instead, gradually, piece by piece, God began putting things together. They did an MRI of his little brain, and they said, just know there's going to be damage. We'll figure it out, but just know that. They came back the day of the MRI, and they said, it's clear. But he still couldn't breathe on his own. But then he began to breathe. And then he was able to regulate his temperature and regulate his glucose. But the most important thing a baby has to do is to be able to eat, to suck, and he couldn't at all. And day after day in the NICU, we cajoled, we prayed, we said, look at Papa, he's fat, you can do this, let's go. And little by little, he began to drink an ounce, and then another ounce. I'll never celebrate an entire 3-ounce bottle more in my entire life when he drank it. And then after 4 weeks in the NICU, he went home. And he's got tests ahead of him and all of this. But a couple of days, my daughter sent me a picture I think that we have. He thinks she's hilarious. Why do I believe in miracles? Because of little Copeland David and his crazy little monkey jammies. It's a miracle. He's a miracle. You're a miracle. Your kids are miracles. God's a miracle worker, way maker, promise keeper, light in the darkness. I don't know where you're at today. I don't know what you're praying for. I know in this crowd there's some people that are desperate. You desperately need a healing. You desperately need a restoration. You don't know financially what you're going to do. You have anxiety that you can't overcome. You have depression that you're struggling to make it through. And as I prayed for you this week, as I knew I was coming, the only word I got from God was hope. He said, Geoff, your job is to tell them about me and tell them I'm the God of hope, and I keep my promises. So I believe that God wants to do miracles. We're going to take communion in a moment, and when we do, I would encourage you during that time and during the song to just remind God, God, this is who you are, and I believe that you're doing a miracle. Can I pray for you? Jesus, you are the way maker. You are the miracle worker. You do keep your promises. You are the light in the darkest night. Lord, you do not disappoint us. You do not let us down. Lord, it doesn't always work the way we wish it would, but it doesn't change the fact that you are at work. Our faith is in you, Lord. Lord, I pray for people who are here today who are desperate. You know their need. You know exactly what they're praying for. And Lord, I pray in these next few moments that hope will be renewed in their hearts and their lives, even as we remember your sacrifice on the cross and your resurrection, that we will remember that you are the miracle worker. Lord, we ask it in your name. Amen.